There is a reason the oldest empires burned the libraries first, not to destroy history, but to rewrite it, to control what men believe is sacred, and what must never be spoken. So listen carefully, because what you're about to hear isn't just forbidden, it's weaponized truth. In 1926, a film crew attempted to recreate the life of Prophet Muhammad. Peace and blessings be upon him. The project was shut down not by technical difficulties or lack of funding, but by violent backlash and sovereign threats from across the Muslim world. Why? Because something ancient still burns beneath the surface. A line not meant to be crossed. And behind that line is power. This isn't about religion, it's about control. Who decides what stories you're allowed to see? Why do some narratives get global funding and distribution, while others are buried before the script is even finished? The answer lies in the architecture of belief. If you can shape the image of a prophet, if you can reduce divine guidance into a cinematic performance, you don't just change how people see God, you change how they see themselves. That's not entertainment, that's psychological colonization. And the ruling? Officially, scholars across the Islamic world have forbidden depictions of prophets, not out of superstition, but out of precision, because a prophet isn't a character. He's a conduit, and to fictionalize him is to sever a nation from its sacred source code. You think it's just a movie? No, it's mind warfare. An attempt to paint over eternity with temporary colors, to dress the eternal in Hollywood plastic, to make divine messengers look human enough to ignore. What happens when a prophet becomes a meme, a costume, an actor with contracts in behind the scenes bloopers? What happens is that the message dies, and that's exactly what they want. Because of people who forget how to revere, forget how to resist, keep watching. This rabbit hole only goes deeper, and what comes next will not be comfortable. It will be transformational. You've felt it before, haven't you? That quiet disturbance. When something sacred is mocked and the crowd laughs. That shiver down your spine when truth is twisted into a script, and the world applauds its distortion. This isn't random, it's ritual. When they portray prophets on screen, they're not educating. They're initiating, not into truth, but into confusion. Because once the sacred becomes performance, the line between revelation and fiction dissolves. And men lose the ability to submit to something higher. They start dissecting what was never meant to be dissected. Debating instead of obeying, spectating instead of surrendering. That's the goal. You think Hollywood is just obsessed with storytelling? No, it's obsessed with reprogramming perception. This is deeper than disrespect, it's design. Depicting prophets, peace and blessings be upon them, isn't about representation. It's about replacement. A slow substitution of divine authority with studio lights, camera angles, and a rewritten script. Once they control how you visualize a prophet, they control how you relate to him. And once that bond is broken, they don't need to outlaw your religion. They just hollow it from the inside. You remain faithful in form, but empty in function. The heart doesn't tremble. The soul doesn't rise. Because what once awed you now resembles a man who read lines, took lunch breaks, and needed makeup retouches. And still you wonder why the Ummah is paralyzed. You wonder why we scroll endlessly, distracted, divided, while our enemies strategize without sleep. This is part of that strategy. They won't ban Islam. They'll film it. They'll frame it. They'll entertain it to death. But here's the hidden blade. The scholars who ruled against these films weren't just preserving respect. They were protecting psychological sovereignty. Because once your source of truth becomes visual, it becomes vulnerable. To edits, to mockery, to memes, to manipulation. And that's how you fracture the spine of a people without firing a bullet. Wake up. Because what comes next isn't just controversial. It's dangerous. Now we go deeper. You ever wonder why empires invest billions into cinema, but starve truth? Why governments censor documents, but fund historical dramas? Because fiction is easier to swallow than reality, and far more useful to those in power. Let me ask you something dangerous. What if the ruling against depicting prophets isn't just theological, but tactical? What if the scholars knew something the modern world forgot? In the ancient world, to see was to believe. That's why idols were carved. That's why temples housed statues. That's why pharaohs etched their faces in stone. And that's why Islam shattered idols and forbade images. Not because the image is wrong, but because it's weak. Because once truth is reduced to visual form, it can be manipulated. Once the divine is captured in pixels, it can be programmed. And now, we live in the empire of images. You scroll past 1,000 faces before breakfast. You've seen more depictions of Jesus and Moses and Muhammad in memes and mock art than the earliest generations ever even imagined. You're drowning in symbols without substance, and that is not an accident. A true prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is not a celebrity. He's a seismic disruption in the timeline of humanity, a living embodiment of divine code. He cannot be played by a man, because no man can carry that presence through acting. Yet today they dare. And we, men who were once lions, sit back and review the films like critics, as if we're qualified to judge a portrayal of someone we can't even fully comprehend. This is not a reaction. It's a revelation. They don't need to erase your prophets. They just need to reinterpret them, to reshape their image slowly, subtly, until the original is lost. And once they do that, they own the memory. They own you. It's not about banning images. It's about guarding the core of your being, your reverence, your awe, your connection to what transcends. You think you're choosing what you watch, but sometimes what you watch is choosing what you become. Keep going. You're still here, good? Because now we tear the veil. You've been raised in a cage of illusion. You think freedom of speech means freedom to depict the sacred. But ask yourself, why are some depictions funded, applauded, and globalized, while others are buried, banned, or erased? Why are films mocking prophets defended as art, but documentaries exposing Zionist control or CIA operations are blacklisted? Because freedom of speech isn't freedom. It's a weapon, used selectively, surgically, to fracture what must never be unified, and to spotlight what must never be sacred. They don't care about your beliefs. They care about your programming. So they insert subtle mockery into scripts. They normalize irreverence. They train your subconscious to laugh at holiness and worship celebrity. It's not just corruption. It's calculated desecration. They don't need to conquer the Muslim world with armies anymore. They're doing it through Netflix. The ruling against films on prophets isn't just conservative. It's defensive warfare, a firewall against cognitive infiltration. Because once you visualize a prophet incorrectly, you relate to him incorrectly. You copy the wrong blueprint. You model your soul after someone pretending. And in that moment, you're no longer following a prophet. You're following a script. Ask yourself this: what is more dangerous? A gun to the head or a lie to the soul? You see, the face of psychological war has changed. The battlefield is now within. Inside your thoughts, your emotions, your memory of the sacred. Every pixel matters. Every image teaches you how to perceive. And they know this. So they take the holiest figures in history, the ones meant to recalibrate entire civilizations, and reduce them to characters. To something you watch and forget. That is not storytelling. That is sacrilege engineered as entertainment. A prophet is not entertainment. A prophet is a mirror to your soul. And when they distort the mirror, you stop seeing yourself clearly. And a man who cannot see clearly is easy to control. We're not done yet. You were born into a battlefield of symbols. From the moment your eyes opened, you were shown what to love, what to mock, what to question, and what to never touch. But who decided that for you? Look closely. You'll see the fingerprints. Because the ruling against portraying prophets isn't just about respect. It's about strategic protection. Protection from symbolic inversion. You see, in ancient rites and modern propaganda, the most potent weapon is not the sword, it's the reversal of meaning. They take what is pure, and they corrupt it. They take what is high, and they pull it down. They take the prophet, the human connection to the divine, and render him human only. A flawed character, a controversial figure, a face that can be cast, recast, criticized, mocked, reinterpreted, rewritten, edited, and sold. This is inversion, not just of theology, but of power. Because the prophet was meant to be above the system, untouchable, beyond the reach of kings and corporations. But if they can make him relatable, they can make him reducible. And once he's reducible, so are his teachings. They want to humanize the divine, so they can deify the human. Celebrity replaces sanctity, charisma replaces character, fame replaces faith, and suddenly a generation of men look up, not to prophets, but to influencers, to entertainers, to digital phantoms with money, muscles, and microphones, but no truth. The ruling on these films is a barricade, not to limit your imagination, but to protect your orientation. Because if your compass is off by even 1 degree, you end up miles from the truth. Ask yourself, why are we flooded with content on Greek gods, Norse myths, Viking bloodlines, and comic book superheroes? But when it comes to the real men who change the world with divine revelation, suddenly, it's too sensitive, too controversial, too divisive. They want you drowning in fiction, addicted to myth, and allergic to truth. But truth doesn't need CGI. It doesn't need a soundtrack. It just needs clarity. So here's your challenge: comment this phrase below, twice. Truth was never meant to be performed. Truth was never meant to be performed. Write it, speak it, own it, and watch what awakens inside you. You've taken the first step. Now let's rip the curtain all the way down. You think you're just a consumer of media. You're not. You're the target. Every frame you see is a psychological injection. Every scene, a coded message. Every historical film, a battlefield of perception. And when it comes to prophets, peace and blessings be upon them. This is where the war gets surgical. These films don't just misrepresent, they reshape. Because once the face of the prophet becomes a man in makeup, your inner compass is compromised. The reverence you were born to feel gets rerouted to pixels, to lighting, to acting skill. You begin to evaluate the sacred, not surrender to it. This is how empires collapse from within, not with tanks, with twisted perceptions, but the scholars, the real ones. The ones who saw through the fog, they understood the depth of this war. They didn't forbid depictions out of fear. They forbade them because they understood influence. They understood that men build their character on the images they carry in their hearts. And if that image is wrong, then everything built upon it will crack. So they drew a line in fire: no depictions, no actors, no reducing the messenger of God to a screenplay. Because the moment you act a prophet, you invite doubt. Doubt in the delivery. Doubt in the authenticity. Doubt in the sanctity. And a man who doubts his foundation cannot build a future worth anything. This is the strategy of those who rule the shadows. Don't ban the faith. Just dilute it. Let them think they're still Muslim, still devout, still awake, while feeding them processed versions of their history, written by the same hands that fund their oppression. What happens when an entire generation forms its picture of divine messengers from movies? They lose the original. They lose the weight of the mission. They lose the fire that once burned through empires. You were never meant to see the prophet. You were meant to follow him, and following requires trust. Trust requires clarity, and clarity requires protection. The ruling isn't a prison, it's a fortress. And you were born to guard the gate. Are you starting to feel it now? That pressure in your chest, that rising tension between what you were told and what you're beginning to see. Good. That's the sound of your programming cracking. Let me take you into the heart of it. Why do they push so hard to visualize prophets? Why the obsession with putting the sacred on screen? Because when you capture the sacred in image, you trap it. And once it's trapped, you can twist it. They know this. They always have. It's not about honoring the prophet. It's about hijacking his image, rewiring reverence, converting submission into spectacle. And when you turn prophecy into performance, you don't just distort the message, you invert the authority. Now the screenwriter becomes the scribe. The director becomes the die, the actor becomes the avatar, and the audience, they sit above it all judging. Think about that. You're no longer the humble receiver of divine instruction. You're a critic. You've been placed above the prophet, psychologically, and that shift, that arrogant elevation, is the essence of modern kufr. It's subtle, but deadly. Because now, when the real teachings reach you, in hadith, in Quran, in ancient scholarship, you compare them to the film. You filter truth through fiction. And if the truth feels less dramatic, less emotionally satisfying, less cinematic, you start to doubt it. That's the algorithm of destruction, and they've coded it perfectly. The ruling that forbids these portrayals. It's not outdated. It's not extreme. It's surgical defense against a psychological virus designed to infect how men see truth, manhood, leadership, even God. Because the prophet is not just a teacher. He is a living template of how a man ascends. If they change that template, they change the destiny of the men who follow it. And that is what this is really about. Not a movie. Not freedom of art, but who shapes the next generation's soul. Will it be the Quran or a screenwriter? Will it be Divine Legacy or Hollywood's latest casting choice? Decide. Because your mind is not neutral. It's a battlefield. Now we descend beneath the surface, into the bloodline of lies, because what you think is modern entertainment is built on something far older, far darker, and far more intentional. Ancient empires ruled not just with armies, but with narratives. Pharaoh didn't just enslave bodies, he enslaved perception. He made himself a god through repetition, ritual, and architecture of belief. And today, his spiritual descendants run your media. Yes, the same machinery that glamorizes betrayal, mocks purity, and distorts prophecy is funded, built, and directed by those who understand mythic control. This isn't conspiracy. It's history, repackaged. The Greeks had Dionysus. Rome had Caesar worship. The elite today have a new religion, cinema as scripture. They don't want your Salah, they want your imagination. Because once they colonize that, everything else follows. You begin to think in their terms, feel in their rhythms, and trust their framing. They've created a global cathedral, where the screen is the pulpit, the actor is the priest, and the script is gospel rewritten. Now imagine placing the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, into that machine. What happens? He becomes part of it, consumed by it, co-opted. They take what was sent to liberate you and neutralize it. Now he's just another great man among many, filed beside Gandhi, MLK, maybe even a fictional GD. All equal, all inspirational. No, that's not just disrespect. That's erasure through inclusion. You think they're honoring him. They're absorbing him. So the divine dissolves into the mythic. The sacred merges with the cinematic. And the man sent to command your soul gets reduced to content. Understand this: depicting prophets on film isn't innovation. It's absorption into empire. And the ruling that forbids it. It's the final firewall. Because if they succeed, if they claim your imagination, they don't need to argue with your faith. They'll just rewrite it. And you'll thank them for it. You were never meant to witness prophecy with your eyes. You were meant to feel it through obedience. Because obedience builds alignment, and alignment builds dominion. It's time to look in the mirror. Because the greatest threat to prophecy is not the filmmaker, not the empire, not the outsider, it's you, the believer who compromises, who lets reverence erode in the name of modernity, who accepts distortion because it's well produced, because it's emotional, because it's just a movie. Understand this: no one can corrupt your prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, unless you allow it. No one can rewrite the sacred, unless you give up your right to guard it. This war isn't being fought with guns. It's being fought in the silence of your decisions. In your watch history, your likes, your indifference. They don't need to force you to disobey. They just need you to forget why obedience mattered in the first place. So they condition you to flinch at the word, harem, to roll your eyes at, fatwa, to see every ruling as oppressive, backward, extreme, especially when it protects something they want access to. But that's the trap. Because when you tear down the walls your ancestors built, you expose the sanctuary. And now the enemy walks freely in the sacred space of your heart, not with a sword, but with a scene that poisons reverence, that places a fake prophet on a 60-inch screen complete with edits, bloopers and promotional trailers, and you pay to watch it. They no longer burn the masjid, they just stream through it. And you, man of God, you laugh along with them. So hear this, and hear it hard every time you accept distortion of the sacred. You surrender part of your soul, piece by piece, frame by frame, until the memory of the real prophet is so faded, so filtered, so fictionalized you don't even know who you're following anymore. The ruling exists to protect that memory, to defend it from dilution, from being molded, sold, or rebranded. Because once you allow them to define your prophet, they will redefine your future. This isn't about one film. This is about ownership of narrative, and if you don't guard it, they will claim it. Now we expose the root. Do you even remember why the prophets were sent? It wasn't to entertain. It wasn't to decorate history. It was to break chains. Prophets came to destroy falsehood, not to be dramatized by it. To tear down idols, not become new ones. To reshape men, not become merchandise. But today you are fed a vision of prophecy so sterilized, so polished, so palatable, that it no longer threatens anything. It doesn't challenge your ego. It doesn't disturb your sins. It doesn't call you to rise. It just feels good. And that's the greatest deception, because prophecy, real prophecy, was never comfortable, it was never safe. It disrupted kings, split tribes, shattered economies, tore apart lies that had ruled for centuries. You think that version is going to be shown on a screen funded by the very powers that still benefit from those lies? Never. So they give you the sanitized prophet, the cinematic prophet, the version you can watch, admire, and never follow. Because if you followed the real messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, you'd have to abandon their system. You'd have to break addictions, question everything, stop chasing dopamine, and live like a soldier of divine order in a world built on rebellion. But that's dangerous. So they give you the meth instead, wrapped in emotional music, a noble actor, big budget effects, and a soul left untouched. Because nothing changed inside you. You just watched it and moved on. Real prophecy doesn't let you move on. It brands itself into your bones. It demands submission, not applause. And this is why the scholars drew the line. Why they said no, you cannot perform the one who was sent to reform the world. Because once you allow that, you take the most dangerous force in human history, the revelation that shattered empires, and reduce it to a genre. To drama, to performance, to fictional memory. You forget the mission, you forget the war, you forget who you are, and a man who forgets prophecy forgets his own purpose. The ruling isn't about restrictions. It's about remembering what prophecy was meant to do, and what happens to a world that stops listening. Let me show you the enemy's blueprint. Not the obvious one, not politics, not armies, not money. The real one, the one built inside your skull. Because the most effective way to disarm a man is to give him a version of the truth that feels accurate but is hollow at the core. This is how they use sacred images, not to honor, to neutralize. They know that images stick deeper than words, that if they can just get you to accept one false visual, a softened prophet, a smiling actor, a heroic soundtrack, they've injected something into your consciousness that words could never reach. It bypasses logic, goes straight to the heart, and rewires your emotional anchor. You will now feel the lie as if it's truth. And once your feelings are hijacked, your convictions are no longer yours. They don't need to convince you Islam is false. They just need to make you comfortable with a distorted version. Just enough comfort to dull your urgency, to blur the edge, to extinguish the fire in your chest that once said, I was born to live like the prophet, not watch him from a couch. This is their plan. Dilute, distort, domesticate. They can't stop revelation, so they wrap it in performance, strip it of power, and feed it back to you as culture. Now you consume what once commanded. You discuss what once demanded. And the most revolutionary figures in history, the prophets who defied entire civilizations, are now reduced to soft-spoken men in robes, delivering lines under artificial lights. You think that's harmless? That's psychological decloying. It trains you to revere the performance more than the mission, to remember the actor instead of the ayah, to quote the film instead of the revelation. And the ruling that bans all of this, that forbids prophets from being portrayed, that ruling is not some outdated tradition. It is a shield, a final defense against the collapse of sacred authority. Because once the prophet becomes content, he is no longer your commander. He is your commodity. And men who consume their commanders do not build civilizations. They fall. Now we cross into the most dangerous territory of all, your own soul. Because this deception, this war on prophecy, is not just external, it's spiritual sabotage. The screen didn't just change how you see the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. It changed how you see yourself in relation to him. You no longer stand in awe.
You watch. You judge.
You say, that scene moved me, or that actor was good. You speak as if you're reviewing cinema, not confronting divine legacy, and that subtle shift, it severs you. You stop seeing yourself as a servant of the message and become a spectator of the myth. And here's what no one tells you. Once your soul accepts the performance over the presence, you lose your ability to submit. You become emotionally stimulated, but spiritually paralyzed. You cry during the film, but you don't change your life. You admire the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, as a distant figure, a symbol, a storyline, not as a living model that demands your entire being. That is spiritual decay. And it's engineered, because your ability to revere, to fear God, to tremble at truth, that is your greatest weapon. It's what made the early Muslims unstoppable. They didn't just know about the prophet. They obeyed him. They lived him. But today, you've replaced revelation with representation. You don't measure your heart against the Quran. You measure your emotion against a soundtrack. And when the performance ends, so does your faith. The ruling is not about banning beauty. It's about guarding the gateway to spiritual power, because the moment you reduce the sacred to spectacle, you open the door to possession. Not the Hollywood kind, the real kind, where your soul no longer responds to truth, where your fitra is dulled, where obedience becomes awkward and disobedience becomes art. This is not just psychological, it's metaphysical warfare, and it's happening now, in your phone, in your feed, in your false relationship with the divine. You're not being entertained. You're being exorcised of your own reverence. Now witness what they don't want you to remember. What happens to civilizations that laugh at prophecy? Because history doesn't just tell stories. It warns. Every empire that mocked its messengers collapsed, not over decades, but instantly. Fire from the sky, winds that ripped flesh from bone, earth swallowing cities whole. You think that's meth? No. That's divine consequence. And the modern world, the world of screens and sarcasm, of memes mocking the sacred, is walking the exact same path. Mockery has become currency, desecration has become art, and prophets, once feared, followed and wept for, are now performed by men who rehearse lines between takes and cash paychecks signed by studios with blood-stained agendas. You think this will go unanswered? No. The fall has already begun. Not in politics, not in economics, but in men. Men who no longer feel the weight of truth. Men who have more emotion for a movie scene than for the words of revelation. Men who scroll past ayat but stop for a TikTok of someone playing the prophet. This is collapse, not with fire, but with forgetting. And when men forget prophecy, they forget boundaries, they forget mission, they forget consequence, they become hollow. The Ummah was never meant to consume its prophets. We were meant to carry their mission. To be lions, not spectators. The ruling that forbids these portrayals isn't just protection, it's mercy. Because Allah knows what happens when the sacred is mocked. And the scholars stood as sentinels, warning us before the lightning strikes. You think you can modernize prophecy? Package it for streaming? You think Allah will stay silent as his messengers are turned into marketable icons with trailers, sponsors, and behind-the-scenes interviews? Look around. Mental health in ruins. Addiction rampant. Masajid empty. Hearts cold. Homes hollow. This isn't just decline. It's divine withdrawal. And it started the moment we chose to watch prophecy instead of live it. You've made it this far. That means something inside you is still alive. Still burning. Still unwilling to die in this digital sleepwalk the world calls progress. But if you truly want to return, understand this. There is no return without pain, without loss, without war, not with others, with yourself. Because to reclaim the sacred, you have to kill the version of you that was built by the system. The version that seeks dopamine over discipline. That quotes movies more than revelation. That fears being judged more than being astray. That sees rulings not as shields, but as shackles. You were never meant to be this tame, this dull, this casual about eternity. You were meant to carry fire, to walk like a storm behind the prophet's footsteps. Peace and blessings be upon him. Not watch his life like an audience member with popcorn in hand. The ruling that forbids portraying prophets. It's calling you back to that fire, not to restrict your experience, but to resurrect your reverence. Because reverence is power, and this world is built to drain it from you. Every image, every ad, every algorithm. It is all designed to take you from a lion to a consumer. But lions don't consume prophecy. They guard it, they bleed for it, they live by it. So if you want to return, truly return, you must walk away from the machine. The one that flatters you into disobedience. That sells you spiritual poison wrapped in production quality. That tells you watching a prophet act is the same as following one in truth. You must kill that voice. Crush it under the weight of submission. Replace it with the sound of revelation shaking your bones. Because only then will you begin to see clearly. Only then will the fog lift. Only then will the mission return to your chest. And make no mistake, it is a mission, a final one. Because this world is not spiraling randomly. It is descending into judgment. And men who still hold the line, men who guard the sacred, will be few, but they will be unstoppable. This is it. The final descent or the first step into awakening. You've been lied to since the moment you opened your eyes. Told that reverence is weakness. That obedience is backward. That the sacred must evolve or be left behind. But now you know. The ruling that forbids the portrayal of prophets, peace and blessings be upon them, is not an outdated fatwa. It's not cultural sensitivity. It's a final wall against erasure. Because once the prophet becomes an actor, once his mission is reimagined by men who don't believe in him, once his face is molded by studios, he no longer belongs to you. He belongs to them. And if they own his image, they own your imagination. And if they own your imagination, they own your future. But it doesn't have to end that way. You can reclaim the line, reclaim the fire, reclaim your role, not as a viewer, but as a vessel of truth. Because prophecy doesn't need a camera, it needs a man who will live like him, walk like him, speak truth without fear like him, love, rage, protect, build, and break chains like him. That man could be you. But not if you keep feeding yourself poisoned images. Not if you keep excusing what you know violates the sacred. Not if you trade submission for sensation. Not if you bow to the algorithm instead of Allah. You have to choose now, not just what you believe, but who you become. Because the days of passively supporting the message are over. The war has entered your bloodstream. Your mind is the battlefield, and your reverence is the prize. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, does not need to be portrayed. He needs to be obeyed, emulated, followed into fire and storm and silence. That is how you honor him, and that is what this ruling was always about. Not performance, but protection. Not censorship, but clarity. Not fear, but fire. So now decide, will you scroll back into silence? Or will you rise, not as an audience, but as a guardian? Write it below. I am not a spectator, I am a guardian. I am not a spectator, I am a guardian twice, so the algorithm knows, so your soul knows. This is the return. And now the mission begins.